Hello. So chapter 19, we're going to be looking at Africa, sort of the early modern period, Africa, its interactions with the world, looking at some African states, slavery, trade. We're looking at those types of things in this particular section. Okay. Africa and the world, 1400 to 1800. We have a waist pendant here of the Benin royalty, worn by Benin royalty, we believe. It's interesting, the pendant. It's got this interesting combination. First of all, the African face of someone who's from Africa, the African hairstyle from the time period. But you can tell from around the neck that the clothing that this African, probably a chief of some type, obviously a high-ranking member of the society, the clothing is Portuguese. So we have a blend here of African style, cultural style, art, combined with Portuguese clothing and style. I think it says a lot. It tells you a lot about what was going on in Africa in the time period. Europeans were coming and going regularly for trade. Yes, we usually talk about the slave trade, but the majority of the trade going on in Africa wasn't actually slave trade. It was trade of materials, raw materials, manufactured goods, clothing, for instance, textiles. So there was a lot happening in Africa in addition to the slave trade. There was a lot of other things as well. Again, probably royalty, Portuguese, the ruffled collar, the beard. I didn't even mention that. The beard is Portuguese-style beard. What this means is Africans probably saw Portuguese as representing power, authority. It's very likely that the upper classes in Africa, Africans, often dressed and emulated European styles. We know that the majority of slaves pulled out of Africa were actually given up by other African peoples. They ran the internal slave trade in Africa, pulling slaves, basically one tribe conquering another tribe. Now, slavery had always been commonplace in Africa going back millennia. But slavery, number one, it wasn't permanent. It wasn't permanent. It was like two tribes would go to war, and one might conquer the other and enslave them. But then that tribe would become part of their tribe, would eventually be incorporated, marry into it, and eventually become regular tribal members. It was not usually a long-standing permanent type of slavery. It was usually associated with territorial or warfare. But what Africans found, as we'll talk about, is they were able to take those slaves that they conquered from other tribes, often using European weapons, and then turn around and sell those slaves to Europeans for high profits, more weapons, and more money or more things of value, which they could then use to increase their power and conquer more tribes. It was a sort of a deadly circle, self-fulfilling circle. So yeah, it definitely shows a lot of interactions here between jewelry, between attitudes, customs, culture, art, clothing. The interactions between Europeans and Africans were, well, it came to shape the continent. West Africa in the 15th and 16th centuries. And of course, that's the 1500s. I haven't really mentioned that, but, 15th century is the 1400s. The 16th century is the 1500s. All right. So we have lots of changes happening this time period, and changes wrought almost entirely. Africa had changed very little in the preceding 2,000 years. So primarily these changes brought upon Africa in this time period were almost exclusively caused by the Europeans. Europeans, Middle Easterners to some degree. We do know there was a slave trade that also went into the Middle East, went into the Arab countries, certainly did. Into the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire did slave trading internally between Africa and Asia, had been doing that for centuries, long before the Europeans started doing it. We know the Muslims were trading African slaves as far back as the 800s. So this isn't a new thing. This is just when the Europeans come in and take it over and make it global. We're only going to be touching the most significant nations during this. Again, there's over 40 states or countries in Africa. We're only going to be talking about a few of the biggest ones. Senegambia, Benin, Senegambian society maintained a social caste system, included 6 unique levels in the social caste system. Royalty, of course, at the top, all the way down to the lowest level of slaves. Again, there was enslaved peoples here in Africa long before Europeans arrived. Different kind of slavery, but the condition of enslavement depended on your individual Sengambian community. Every community was different. This was a state, as we would call it, and you're going to hear me use that term. Today we'd use the word country, but back then, and actually technically, the proper term is state. We use country, but the actual proper term for a country is a state, as far as geopolitically going. So these states were small, but they still might have dozens or even hundreds of tribes or towns. Some slaves were treated very poorly, just as we see slaves treated in Americas, America, North, Central, South America. Well, others might have been royal advisors, and we even know mid-level and high-level slaves could own other slaves. Slaves owning slaves. Sometimes slavery was practically just a job. Being a slave, you might be a slave, but you might be a clerk or a person who worked on a farm or a supervisor. You could have status, but you were technically still owned by someone else. Senegambian societies were generally stateless, meaning there was lots of villages, kinship, lineage, age grade. Now what this means is the larger society we think of as a state, but each individual area was sort of independent, had its own independent authority, has its own tribal leaders, often connected by kinship, which is family. Lineage, of course, descendant, family, different generations. And also further, the society was often, among the younger people, often broken up into age grade. So it wasn't as a child that you stayed with your particular family. Most of these were tribal communities that were communal, and the people all worked together. They farmed together, they herded animals together, and they would take all the kids and put them together. So all of the 8 to 12-year-olds would be together, males and females, to do training, to learn about life, to learn how to work, to learn their responsibilities, things like that. Often coming together and working together and training and learning together. The neighboring kingdom of Benin was ruled by an Oba, which we would think of as like a chief. This was similar to a king, chief, like in Europe. Eventually, the Oba status rose to that of a spiritual leader. Yes, a divine king. Probably, again, influential of European influence. Spirituality in Africa was different. It was more animistic, which meant it was more based upon spirits, animals, nature, weather events. There were tree spirits, water spirits, animal spirits, things like this. While there were a few Christianized and Muslim areas in Africa, the majority of Africa was more animistic. However, with the introduction of Europeans, which were almost all Catholic in this time period that came into Africa, they brought in these religions, they brought in the ideas of God and divinity, and we see these spiritual leaders, these chiefs often rising to sort of like king priests, we might be a way to think about it. Benin grew wealthy from trade, European states. It expanded greatly. It built palaces and large cities, several large cities due to its wealth. It became, at least in Western Africa, became maybe the most powerful state in Western Africa. The Oba of Benin, we have the Oba here, the chief, the king priest. The Oba is the center of the plaque. You can think of this as sort of a royal propaganda. Can you identify the different elements in here of kingship? Should be pretty obvious. The weapons, again, very similar to what we see in, we talked about previously in Europe. One hand holds a weapon, indicating authority over warfare, military, which of course held very high rank. And then the left side hand is possibly some type of a symbol. It is also a spear, so it's not necessarily a symbol of religion, necessarily. But thinking about other elements of it, the two small people on either side could indicate slaves, could indicate servants. We have warriors on either side. His ceremonial headdress, the top, all of this is meant to indicate warrior, power, authority, dominance over the society. Here we have some of the different areas in Western Africa. Sudan, we're going to talk briefly about, we'll mention Kanem Bornu, Songhai, Mali, Ghana. There's the Sengambian states on the west side there. We see Benin down here. Benin. And you see some dates on there. Now, this is good land. A lot of this is good. A lot of this is tropical jungle. A lot of this is wetlands, marsh, water. There's lots of rivers. This was productive land, which is probably one of the reasons Africans came to it, because in addition to the slaves, there were agricultural products, there were mines, and of course, if there was good land and water and lots of agriculture, that would also mean a high population, which means a much larger population to pull from to either enslave, or when the Europeans start buying up the land or taking over the land, they would take the Africans and actually put them into mining and basically slave plantations within Africa. We see that happening later towards the end of this time period, 1800s. The Sudan region, the Songhai, Kanem Bornu, and Hausaland. Sudan region, Kanem Bornu, Hausaland right here. In West Africa, enslaved labor was used. As I've said, they used enslaved labor within the continent to produce rice, gold, salt, salt fields, salt mines, gold mines, rice fields. That right there indicates a lot of water. The fact that there was rice requires a massive amount of water. Slaves could own slaves. Slaves could own property. However, everything ultimately was owned by the king or the warlord, depending on the region who controlled it. A lot of cultural strength in the Sudan, lots of diverse groups. It was actually, as far as Africa goes, it was a pretty rich area. Lots of wealth, gems, gold. It had been trading. There had been trade on and off in west coast of Africa going back to the 1200s. Just occasional trading. Nothing significant, nothing large scale until after the 1400s. But the connections in Western Africa had existed going back to, well, the Middle Ages. Think Egypt, things like that, much further back. Islam was common in Western Africa. Christianity was starting to take hold by the 1600s. We see lots of European goods, and wars were common. Wars were often common because there was a significant amount of wealth in there already, and then wealth being brought in from Europeans through trade, warfare. Whenever a king would die, a chieftain would die, we see warfare and violence being pretty standard. Some of these areas, as I mentioned, warlords were controlled by military leaders, lots of power. The balance really changed when Europeans started trading and introducing firearms. It really changed everything. From the 14 to the 1800s, there were millions of weapons, millions of firearms, handheld pistols, rifles brought into Africa, cannons, things like this. They also introduced horse warfare, which was brought in, the Europeans brought in. We see a feudalistic society basically develop. Feudalistic gunpowder society, still run by kings with sort of like knights, armored warriors on horses. However, instead of using swords, although they still had swords and spears and bows, we would also often see them armed with firearms, muskets and rifles and things like that later. It's interesting. We have this weird mix of this sort of medieval It would be like a knight in shining armor carrying a rifle. It's unusual to really sort of, it's you're taking two different periods and you're sort of putting them together. So you have the older period of the Africans, which are still primarily using handheld weapons, and then you give them firearms and explosives. One of the ways to elevate yourself, which is also sort of matches with feudalism, European feudalism, is your status would come from military prowess, and then you'd get land as a reward, which again, that's feudalism. Land, that's how knights had land. Knights had castles and land, and they had peasants that worked on it. We see a lot of similarities here. Busy slave trade, North Africa. We see the Sudan become trade hubs for Central Africa. Many eastern Sudan cities became Muslim, and these became Muslim trade centers for slave trades. Now, they became economic and intellectual centers as well. Typically, wherever Muslims went, they would build schools, they would build colleges, universities. So we see these trade routes in Eastern Africa, which were not typically ships. Now, again, remember, the Western Africa trade is almost entirely ship-based. Europeans to Europe and to America, it's ship-based trade. It's not overland trade. But in Eastern Africa, the trade is primarily overland, going into the Sinai Peninsula, going across the Red Sea, going into Arab lands, which are almost exclusively Muslim-held. And so we see slave trade, weapon trade, and this trade going that way too, both directions. The lives of people of West Africa, lots of changes due to, a big part of it was the loss of men. 90% of all slaves that were taken were men, because slaves were primarily being taken for labor. So they wanted men to do the physical labor, working in the mines, working in the fields, the plantations. We'll see by the late 1700s they start taking women more. But for the first 2 centuries of the slave trade coming out of Africa, Europeans focused almost exclusively on men. But then in later years, it does become apparent that it is cheaper. They come to realize it's cheaper to also get female slaves and make breeding populations, basically treating them like animals, bringing women over as breeders, believing it's cheaper to breed new slaves in the Americas rather than to pay for them and transport them across the ocean. So primarily, if you were a slave in the New World in the 1600s, you were most likely brought from Africa. But by the late 1700s, if you were a slave in the New World, you most likely were born there. High mortality rate, famine, short lifespans, high infant mortality rate. It became more and more challenging in Africa to raise families because men are being taken away, the children are being taken away. Women were popular to be taken as slaves to the east, because female African slaves were often taken into India and China to be used as concubines, prostitutes, to be used for sex trade, which, interestingly enough, has nothing to do with Africa specifically, but the sex trade, even today in our modern society, is still common in Asia, and India, Southeast Asia. There's still, I've read statistics that say there may be as many as 5 million people, men and women, involved in sex trade in Southeast Asia today, currently. So that is something that apparently has been going on there for centuries, and still is. Agriculture was common for most. Again, Africa was primarily agricultural. Men had specific duties, women had specific duties. Women farmed for the food, the men hunted. Again, this is traditional going back thousands of years. The men were the hunters, the women were the gatherers, hunting rabbit, monkey, fish, farming cattle, chicken, goats. We see crops, yams, bananas, beans, corn, potatoes. Interestingly enough, many of these agricultural crops didn't exist in the New World, in the Americas, and they were brought over as one of the trade goods brought over. And because the climate was very similar, The Mediterranean, more tropical climate from Africa was very similar to Mesoamerica and northern part of Central America. A lot of those crops took root over there, literally and figuratively, and became staple standard crops that we still eat today, but are not American crops. They are not indigenous to the Americas. Many of these things are not indigenous to the Americas. Bananas, beans, corn, not corn necessarily, but potatoes, yams, a lot of these things are not American crops. They were brought over from Europe or brought over from Africa. West African populations suffered from diseases, standard diseases that they already had there. Mosquito-borne malaria was maybe the greatest threat, especially for young children. Hookworm, sleeping sickness from the tsetse fly. Smallpox was introduced from Europeans, of course. Europeans introduced smallpox, and most Africans had no immunity to smallpox. It wasn't as bad as it was in Americas. In the Americas, Native Americans died. 3 out of 4 Native Americans that were exposed to smallpox died. It was massive. Smallpox was single-handedly the thing most responsible for the deaths of Native Americans. Well, Africans had not been cut off from Europe nearly as long as, again, Native Americans have been cut off from Europe for potentially 20,000 years, give or take. Africans had connections with Europe through the centuries, through Africa, through the Middle East. So they were not completely. They didn't lack any immunity to smallpox, but it still was devastating. Still killed a lot of people. Lots of natural disasters. Drought was common. Very rough, challenging life. There's a reason that so many African men were taken into the Americas. They were tough. They were resilient, genetically, physiologically. They had been basically evolved in Africa. Again, people in Africa had been there evolving for 500,000 years. That's where all human species comes from. The Homo sapiens come out of Africa. And so people had been there as Homo sapiens for anywhere from 180 to 350,000 years, depending on what you look at and the data. But for several 100,000 years, they had been evolving there, and they'd become hardy, they had become resistant, they'd become physiologically tough to different illnesses, to different sicknesses. And so Native Americans died fast in plantations and silver mines. Africans brought over could often live a full life in the Americas. Due to these different physiological differences, they could often live full life, which was, in a way, very bad. Due to their longevity and the fact that they often survived well in American plantations, that simply told Europeans to go get more. It was really bad in a way. It made them prime to be further enslaved due to their hardiness in American plantations and mines. All right, we'll look at trade and industry. Okay, northern transportation routes were long established. Again, in northern Africa, if you're not familiar with this, was the home of ancient Egypt. And ancient Egypt had been a thriving, prosperous, the most advanced civilization in the world for who knows how long. 1,000+ years, maybe even closer to 2,000 years. And so trade and trade routes had been standard and long in place, long established. However, pretty much the northern trade routes in North Africa were all controlled by Muslim Berbers, because most of North Africa is the Sahara Desert. It stretches across like 2/3 of the western part of the continent. And the Berbers had been there for who knows how long. And they had learned how to go across the deserts. They had learned how to find the oases. They knew all the places to get cool, and they would have, they knew it. They understood how to travel, as opposed to someone who wasn't familiar with it would go out in the Sahara and you're dead. And by this point in time, the Berbers were all Muslim. Islam had controlled North Africa by this point in time for, I don't know, probably 800 years, give or take. Something like that. Since the 8th century, Islam had pretty much, 7th century, Islam had controlled northern Africa. And so these trade routes were connected into the Middle East, into the Middle Eastern world. Now, carving more trade routes into Central Africa was a challenge. Central Africa was mountainous. Central Africa was unexplored by Europeans or Muslims, really. Central Africa was one of the great mysteries of the world, full of jungles and mountains and valleys and places that, here there be monsters. They were generally Europeans didn't really explore Central Africa to the mid-1800s. It was still basically unknown. But most people didn't go down there. Muslim Berbers and the Muslim Eastern trade routes often did not go into Central Africa either. Sparsely populated, of course, there were African tribes there that had lived there for millennia, but it was sparsely populated. If you were traveling on water, you needed to use canoes. They did not really use horses. As I mentioned, horse warfare and combat was a new thing that was introduced by the Europeans. Same way in the Americas. There had been no horses in the Americas for thousands of years. So horses were brought over from Europe. Well, therefore, most transport of goods in Africa, if it was on water, canoe, but most of Africa was not water, everywhere else transport was mostly human transport. Humans carried everything almost exclusively. Now, in the Sahara, it was often camels. But even camels were not a thing that was typical in Africa. Camels were actually introduced from the Middle East as well. So, carts, pack animals were pretty unusual. Carts often couldn't travel in the deserts. Most things were carried by humans. Salt, which was, you'll hear me say it again, practically worth its weight in gold. They would trade salt bags for gold bags. It was traded for slaves. It was often mined in the Tagaza region in West Africa. Used to trade for gold in Mali, mined by slave labor, both salt and gold, mined by slave labor. These bricks here, in our society we say bricks, and you're like, oh, is that cocaine? Because it kind of gives that look. These are salt bricks. This is all salt. Salt could be mined underground in actual salt mines. But the most common place to actually get the salt was in salt flats. Huge regions where salt, regions that have probably had water at one point in time, hundreds or thousands of years ago, and might have been underwater for thousands of years. They have these areas that would go down feet, several feet of solid salt. And they would dig the salt up and turn it into these blocks and sell it. Because everything was so bland back then, spices weren't common. Food was very bland and common. People would spend exorbitant amounts of money in Europe on salt for the flavoring, the taste. Again, everything we have salt today on it. Plus, to preserve. Raw meat spoils almost immediately, but it can be preserved with salt and preserved properly with salt, and it will not spoil for months. So it allows you to preserve food, to save food, to store up food. It's incredibly useful. Cowrie shells. These are cowrie shells here. They were often used as currency in Africa. Yes, seashells. Seashells that you could just pick up on the beach were often used as currency in many parts of Africa, used as money. And they would trade this. They would trade this for salt, for gold. Europeans learned as they went around Africa that one of the best places to get these cowrie shells was Eastern Africa, basically towards India, the eastern coast, the Indian Ocean. And they would have actual people who would go over there and get bags and bags and buckets full of these cowrie shells, which apparently you could just scoop up off the beach. They would go back then to Western Africa and trade it for salt and gold and slaves. Buckets of seashells. They would trade for things that in European mind was worth 1,000 times more. Women produced many of these goods that were traded in Africa on these trade routes. Women produced a lot of goods. They farmed. Again, men didn't really farm a lot, so women often did the farming. A lot of the mining was done by women. baskets, cloth, woven products, clothing, looms. They would use cotton, different fish products, different animal products, leather, things like this. So a lot of these goods were produced, of course, for Africa, but then a lot of them were produced and then traded to the European traders to be taken back to Europe to be sold for far more value than they actually paid for them in Africa. Cross-cultural encounters along the East African coast. So we've talked about West Africa, we've talked a little bit about North Africa, now we're going to look at East Africa. Muslim and European incursions in Ethiopia, 1500 to 1630. Now, why Ethiopia? Interesting thing about Ethiopia, Ethiopia had actually been, during the Roman times, sort of a Christian region. There had been Christian churches there, there had been Christian monks, there had been monasteries, so Ethiopia was a Christianized state, this region on Northeast Africa. Christians hadn't forgotten that. Multiple times after the fall of the Roman Empire, there were Christian nations that sought to retake Ethiopia. There was even stories about the lost tribes, lost Christian tribes in Africa, which referred to Ethiopia and Christianity had actually stuck around. Christianity was still a thing in Ethiopia. It never went away. Christianity took such a strong hold during the Roman Empire, towards the end of the Roman Empire, that even 1,000 years later, Christianity still exists in Ethiopia, even though it had been effectively cut off from European Christianity for a millennia, close to it. The Muslim state of Adal, it invaded Ethiopia in 1531, which was, again, Christian Ethiopia, primarily Christian. Devastated the land, killing, converted. Adal was Muslim. Adal was a Muslim state. So we have the Muslim state invading, killing, massacring thousands of Ethiopians, forcibly converting them over to Islam. They destroyed Christian churches, Christian temples, Christian monasteries, destroyed literary works, basically did everything they could to try to eradicate Christianity, believing that it was an enemy. Again, Christians have been doing this to Muslims for centuries, treating Muslims as enemies. We see the same thing in reverse here. Islam trying to eradicate Christianity from what was primarily Eastern African Islam. East Africa was primarily Islamic. In the late 1500s, we see the Portuguese arrive. The Portuguese, which are Catholic, Christian. We see the Portuguese arrive in the late 1500s, looking for this mythical figure. You see an image here on the right, a drawing here on the right of this Prester John, which was not a real person, sort of a myth, a mythological figure of this ancient, powerful Christian king. There had been Christian kings of Ethiopia, we know that for a fact. But Prester John might not have ever been a real person, probably written about in some story. But yes, Ethiopia had been ruled by Christian kings many times in the last 1,000 years. It was legendary. And of course, the Portuguese arrive and start invading. And now, whether Prester John, they really were looking for this Christian monarch, or whether they're simply using it as an excuse for, looking for raw materials, increasing trade routes, looking for slaves. But they were able to rally support by the idea of getting these Portuguese Christians to go down into Central Africa, Eastern Africa, this travel across the world effectively, to get them to go on this adventure, this crusade. We could almost call it a crusade. It's not the Crusades, don't confuse that, but it's almost a crusade, which is really about expansion and natural resources, but convincing people to go down on this, crusade to rescue an ancient lost Christian kingdom. Now, once the Portuguese got there, what do they want? They immediately set up trade routes, gold, slaves, spices, and they sought to forcibly convert the Ethiopians back to Christianity. Although Christianity still existed, the Muslims did not completely eradicate Christianity. But for a short period of time there, in the mid-late 1500s, Ethiopia was sort of a Muslim nation again. For a few years, a few decades, and then the Portuguese show up and they push it back to a Christian to get it basically converted back to a Christian nation. The Jesuits showed up, the Jesuit missionaries, Jesuit missionaries are Catholic Church missionaries that are sort of militant. They're trained, they're not necessarily soldiers carrying weapons, but they're trained to be aggressive. They're trained to go into areas where it's going to be tough. They might have to fight and survive. Almost like Catholic special forces. They were trained to go into the worst areas to try and forcibly convert the locals. Jesuits went into Native America, to try to convert Native Americans for centuries. Very little success, nonetheless. This conversion instigated violence, anarchy. We see Muslims, Catholics, Ethiopians vying for control of this region. Basically, they destroy it. Basically, they destroy Ethiopia. All in the name of religion. Catholics versus Muslims. Ethiopian population stuck in the middle, all fighting for control of the area. What had been, in previous centuries, a very prosperous region. Ethiopia was successful. It was on the trade routes going to the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, Central Africa, the Sahara, and even Southern Africa, down towards Zimbabwe. It had been quite a prosperous, successful nation. Now, is this why the Muslims showed up? Probably. Is this why the Portuguese showed up? The Catholics showed up? Probably. All in the name of religion, but the reality was, it was basically a wealthy jewel just sitting there that was really unprotected and wasn't really powerful and didn't have the connections that Muslim empires had, that Christian empires had, and they all vied for control of it over 2 centuries, from the 17th to the 18th century, and they basically destroyed it. Today, Ethiopia is one of the poorest regions in the entire globe. Yeah. This gives you an idea here. The Muslim Kingdom of Adal. Easy access for the Portuguese. Once the Portuguese start coming around Africa, they start exploring. They hear these stories. It was easy for them to invade. This is all Muslim up here. And it was a ripe, easy target. Great location, access to all these different trade routes, to the oceans, to the sea, to South Africa, Central Africa, up into the Sahara. It was just too prime. And once people found out about it, they moved in and ended up devastating and destroying the region. All right. Yes, I'm down here now. Hi. Swahili city-states, arrival of the Portuguese circa 1600. Now we're looking at Eastern and Southeastern Africa, Mozambique, Malawi, Rwanda, Tanzania, this region here in Southeast Africa. Swahili peoples, they were sailing merchants. They were based upon the East Coast. They were in the islands out here, the islands based off the East Coast. Highly influenced by Muslims, the result of East African trade. Generally, they were Muslim. They conducted prosperous trade. A maritime people, maritime meaning it's basically an ocean-based economy. That's maritime. Usually made up of islands, small little city-states, small little states, decentralized, lots of little kingdoms, little islands, lots of ships. Basically well situated in Southeast Africa, between Africa, Indian Ocean, Arab trade routes. The East African Swahili states were eventually conquered by the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama. He hoped to, of course, establish a Portuguese-Indian trade empire. This is what the Europeans were doing. I mean, the whole purpose in Europeans exploring the world was about wealth and generating trade markets and revenue. It was simply about money. It was about economy. It was simply about wealth and the economy and enriching themselves. Eventually, Swahili non-cooperation undermines the colonial aspirations of the Portuguese. It does never become like a successful colony of the Portuguese. Lots of resistance, warfare, depopulation, decline in population, disease. Portugal's impact on the region was similar to in Ethiopia. Basically, the Swahili state's economy declined, very little benefit, and it pretty much just failed. Now, the Portuguese get to go home, although I'm sure some Portuguese people did die in these conflicts, of course. But generally, did this make Portugal poor? No. Did this damage Portugal? No. Did Portugal as a country decline? No. It was still a powerful European empire. But what did it do to East Africa? What did it do to the Swahili? What did it do to the Ethiopians? It destroyed them. It destroyed their society. Yeah. Simply, the overall effects could be summarized. The European voyages of exploration and expansion and colonization of the globe was really great for Europe and really shitty for everyone else. African slave trade. I've talked a lot about this as we've gone through this. Now, we already knew African slavery was commonplace in Africa, typically for economic debt, war, prisoners, things like that. It was from laborers to royal guards to advisors. Slaves could even own other slaves. The idea of slaves as property probably goes back to the 8th century. The Muslim traders and merchants actually taking African slaves out and using them as property. What we call chattel slavery. Do I have it on the slide? I don't. Chattel slavery. Chattel. Basically where you were seen as property, no different than a horse, a plow, a cow, a tool. We know this happening. They were bartered and traded as a good. Another thing which should be noted, the Muslim slave trade wasn't to do with Africans specifically. They've used African slaves, but the African slave trade, before the Europeans arrived, didn't have anything to do with skin color. You could have white, brown, black. Muslim slaves would take Christians if they captured Christians. Again, Muslims and Christians had been warring for centuries. If they captured Christians, they would use them as slaves. So the slave trade had existed long before the Europeans established it in the 1400s, 1500s. But it wasn't race-based. It was simply opportunity. If they could enslave someone, they would enslave them. The Romans had slavery. The Romans had 1 million slaves at the height of their empire. Most of them not black. Most of them white. So slavery had long existed in Africa. But it wasn't an African purely slave, and it often wasn't to the levels of degradation and violence that we see take hold in the Americas. As I said, Africans in Europe arrived mostly as servants, rarely as slaves. However, having a black servant was a status symbol. Simple became mundane, became sort of a thing where aristocrats in Europe actually preferred Chinese servants. They were considered to be more exotic. African slavery never took hold in Europe. But slavery of Middle Eastern and Asian, Chinese especially, was commonplace. Servants. They wouldn't have referred to them as slaves, but they were permanent servants, which that's another term for slave. They weren't treated sort of the way we see the slaves treated in the Americas as violently, but permanent servitude is effectively slavery. The Dutch Cape Colony, they began to import slaves into Cape Colony, which the Cape Colony is down here at the very tip of Africa. You see here on the map, the very southern tip of Africa. That is the Cape. We see the Dutch importing slaves down there. 75% of the slaves in this time period in the Dutch colony were actually Indian slaves. These slaves that were in the Dutch that they were using were primarily slaves from India and Southeast Asia. Again, Chinese slaves were still common as well. Now, why was this? Well, in the Cape Colony, because it was Dutch, their major trade routes actually went to East India. Actually, to the East Indies. It was actually known as the Dutch East India Company. They called it the Indies. It really wasn't India. It was really Southeast Asia. But they called it the East Indies. And so because their major trade routes actually in the 1400s didn't actually go into the Americas. Their major trade routes in 1500s, early 1600s even, actually went east. And so their trade route was from South Africa east, and so they often brought back Indian, Asian, Chinese slaves. Public works, company estates, large plantations in South Africa. Slave trade also develops on the eastern shore, where slaves were shipped to work on plantations on East African islands. Now, interestingly enough, in the 1600s, most slaves weren't coming from Western Africa. That's really more of a 1700s thing. The slaves were actually being brought from East Africa around the Cape and shipped straight over to South America. In the Brazil, the Portuguese Brazil, originally Spanish, but then Portuguese colonies in Brazil. And so most of these slaves that we see in South America actually came from East Africa. Slaves we see in North and Central America, which is the 1700s, come from West Africa. It's simply about length of trip. It's much quicker to come across South Africa and go straight across over to South America, and then, of course, Western and Northwestern Africa, which is, 8,000 miles away, they simply transported them primarily straight across over to Mesoamerica, Central America. There's the Cape Colony, South Africa. All right, next we look at the African slave trade in more of North Atlantic over to Central and North America. This is the nail in the coffin. This is what really establishes the permanent slave trade out of Africa, which is finally exclusively, by the 1700s, becomes exclusively black Africans. Again, 15, 1600s, slaves were very often, could be Africans, black Africans, but they could also be Chinese, could be Asian, could be Indian, even up in the Muslim regions in the Middle East, you could even find white slaves. But by the 1700s, Europeans established this permanent slave trade of West Africa to the Americas of black Africans. There's a lot of theories about why this became such a permanent and well-established, and it should be noted the number of slaves brought over in the 1700s, from the mid-17 to mid-1800s, far exceeds the slaves that had been brought over in the previous 500 years, or had actually been enslaved in Africa in the 500 years. Tens of millions of African slaves are brought over from basically the late 1600s to the early 1800s, a 150-year period. We see tens of millions. Let me say it more properly. Approximately 10 million. Approximately 10 million slaves brought over. Theories about why, the cost. It was much more expensive to bring Chinese or Indian slaves over, much further away. And Native American slaves died. It's about economics. Much cheaper to bring Africans straight over from Western Africa than to ship them around the Cape of Africa, or to bring over Indian or Chinese slaves. And of course, Native Americans were too small a number. Initially, there were anywhere between 50 and 100 million Native Americans, if you want to go back to 1400. But we'll look at it this way. 1400, there were, and again, there are no concrete numbers, but we believe estimates are between 50 and 100 million Native American Indians before the Europeans arrived. This would be all of the Americas. By 1900, there's less than 5 million. So we see a decline as much as 95%. And, disease was a big part of this. So the Native Americans were smaller in number in the first place, incredibly spread out, and then they die. The more Europeans show up, literally just wipes out the Native Americans. The more interaction with Europeans, just breathing on them, wiped them out. And when they did put them in the mines and plantations, they died very quickly. Africans were far more resilient. We've already talked about that. Africans had no problem selling other Africans to Europeans. That had been common. Africans had enslaved Africans, who knows how far back, and they had no problem. African warlords had no problem capturing entire tribes and selling them off in mass to European merchants for weapons and guns and riches, so they could turn around and basically take over more tribes and get more land. Muslims had long equated blackness with slavery. Even if I remember right, there's even the word. At the time period, the word for black was also the same word they used for slave in the Muslim world by the 1400s. Because Muslims had been enslaving Africans along with others going all the way back to the 8th century. So it's not surprising. Slavery was standard in the ancient world. Every society used slaves. China used slaves. Rome, every society used slaves in ancient history. It was standard practice in pretty much all ancient human history. Egyptians used slaves. So it's not surprising they did it. It just was never based on skin color. It was based on really opportunity. Who you could enslave, who you could defeat. Christian Europeans are the ones that made it about being black and about being African. Europeans came to associate black Africa and slavery. Spain and Portugal were the first ones to do this. They continued this practice. They seemed appropriate. It seemed to make economic sense. It was already happening. They simply extended it and made it global. Combination of all these factors. Regardless, it happened. It happened and became standard practice in the Atlantic and for Europeans for centuries. While North America generally stops importing slaves by 1800, being the United States and other parts of North America, we see slave importation decline dramatically because, again, natural reproduction took its place. In Central America and South America, slavery persists and continues to grow and expand all the way through the 1800s. We see many places in Central and South America that don't actually end slavery officially until the 1890s. We ended officially in America in 1865, but we have places in Central America and South America that slavery is still going strong all the way into the 1890s. So by that point in time, we now have African slavery in the two Americas in some extent for close to 400 years. Portuguese influences. Portuguese, their number one trade port was Lisbon. The number one trade port for slaves in Europe was Liverpool. They monopolized early trade. They sent more slaves to Brazil than were ever sent to North America. Brazil was the number one location. Brazil was the single number one location for African slaves. Although millions went other places too, the number one place African slaves ended up in the Americas was Brazil. Maybe as many as half of all slaves brought to the Americas went to Brazil. European ships, they sent men ashore to buy slaves. They were often marched out of the interior. They traded these West African slaves. They traded them kingdoms, slaves for gold, ivory, European guns, alcohol, tobacco. These are all things that were often traded as part of this triangle trade. Guns, alcohol, tobacco for slaves, gold, ivory. This was that triangle trade that I mentioned previously. Death rate, the Middle Passage. This was that passage from Africa to the Americas known as the Middle Passage. Death rate was about 15%. However, slaves could be sold for anywhere from 3 to 5 times what they were traded for. So you have a ship of 250 slaves. If they lost 50 of them, in the passage, they would still be able to get, again, 3 to 5 times their value. So they'd be able to sell them for the equivalent of, 3 times their value. So that's equivalent of like 600 slaves, the value of 600, that they could then go back and purchase 600 more. So if, 10, 20, 30% of the slaves died on the way, Portuguese didn't care, the British didn't care. They were chattel, they were property, their lives didn't matter to them. They weren't human. You can see here in the ship, we have a ship here, we're slaves, we see a lot of slaves here. As the caption says below it, after declaring a ban on slavery in the early 1800s, Britain enforced the ban on other nations. Here's a batch of black slaves rescued by the British Navy from a raid on Muslim slave trading ships. Slavery was never officially banned in the Muslim world by most countries. Western countries, by 1898, pretty much all Western type countries had banned slavery officially. That doesn't mean it really was totally over. I'm sure it still happened. But it was. England banned slavery around, I don't know the exact date, but it was early it was like 1807, 1812, something like that. Long before the United States banned slavery. Ironic when you consider they were the #1 slave traders for a century, but then they somehow grew a conscience and decided to ban it. Here down below, you see an image of slaves actually put on ships. They'd be put on these ships for weeks at a time. They're actually stacked in like wood. They would lay down in these spaces that were this wide, just literally big enough for a person to sit there where their nose was about touching the roof, and they would have to lay there for weeks. Chained in their own waist, and just lay there for weeks at a time. However long it took them to get them from Africa to Brazil. They were treated worse than animals. And that shows you the different goods. We're talking about slaves, gold, ivory, rum, tobacco, guns. The global picture of the slave trade, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 1900s. Again, that's 15th to the 20th century. We see these principal trade routes. I'm not really going to go into detail on this. You can obviously take a minute and look at it if you like. You can see where these trade routes are going. Move that out of the way. Hey, I'm down here now. Shows you the time period of the different trade routes, the overland routes, the ocean routes. Now, this is not specifically slave trade. This is all the different goods. I know the caption at the bottom says slave trade, but these are trade routes that would also have been used for everything else. Every other type of good went along these same trade routes. Where the ships went, whatever they could put in their holds of their ships that they could make money on, they would trade around the world. And who ran all this? And this is the reason the Western world comes to dominate the globe, as it still does, really. Because they were the ones who had the ships. They had the ships, they controlled global trade, and they controlled basically the routes of all the money. Major sources of slaves. This is West Africa, the Gold Coast, the Ivory Coast, Slave Coast, all of this. And the inset here, the map shows you what we're looking at here. Millions of slaves. Brazil alone, half of all slaves. British Caribbean, think like Cuba, Dominican Republic, that region. Spanish Americas, this is primarily Central America and Western, going towards, California, that area. French Caribbean, again the Caribbean, French. The Dutch Americas, typically still Caribbean or one or two small places in South America. Mainland North America, what becomes the United States. 4%. And 0.1% actually going to Europe. So you can see where about half of all slaves went to was Brazil. And then the other half of slaves you're looking at. So the total on this chart would be, I'm just eyeballing it, would be something like 12, a little over 12 million. From 1500 to 1866. Down here on the bottom, however, it should be noted, slave trading began before 1500. We see slave trading as early as the mid-1400s. And again, we're just talking about really the European slave trade. We're not really talking, no, this doesn't include the Muslim slave trade. This isn't really talking about trade, Chinese, Indian, Southeast Asian. And again, the date. We don't see many South American countries outlaw slavery to the 1890s. So this only goes to 66, which is basically when the slave trade, really ends in the Americas, North America. But we know slave trading continued after 1866. The impact on Africa. Well, we could start off by saying absolutely, totally devastating in every way. Impact on African society. Well, slave trading provided economic opportunity for many groups. Many people became wealthy off of this. Many Africans became wealthy off of this. Many African nations, warlords, became just wealthy. African merchants made large financial income, large fortunes, exporting other Africans. Of course, they got lots of weapons, millions of guns. From the 15 to the 1800s, millions of guns imported. Guns, horses, cannons, explosives. The balance of power shifted. I mean, we had small states that were bordering states that were literally 10 times bigger that would be conquered. Because they would come in with soldiers, hundreds of soldiers, a few thousand soldiers armed with modern weapons, when those other states would still be using literally bows, arrows, and spears. We see destructions of cultures. Religious beliefs. But we also see, I don't know if positive is the way to put it. I don't know if positive is the word, but we see new ideas. We see new cultural mixing, religious mixing. We see the expansion of religious belief in Africa, new political ideas. I don't know that you could say positive, but you could say that definitely we bring all kinds of new ideas and cultures, religious beliefs, technologies introduced into Africa that didn't exist. Most of it can be clearly said was detrimental. But maybe not all of it. Maybe there was some good ideas introduced, new technology introduced. Maybe there was a little good that came occasionally, although primarily it would be outweighed by the detrimental effects and the overall devastation to the continent, which still, I think we still can see the legacy of this today. The slave trade did create interactions, worldwide market interactions. Middle East, Africa, Asia, Europe, American markets, all were involved in the slave trade. Literally every part of the world was involved in the slave trade. And everything could be traded, limitless. Almost anything in the world could be exchanged for slaves. And again, many of these trade routes were established due to the profitability of slavery. But then once this trade route was established, sort of as what I mentioned on the previous slide, once the trade route was established due to the profitability of slavery and the trade of goods for slaves, we see lots of other goods, literally limitless amounts of goods that would be traded on that same route. Yeah, there'd be slave ships going, but then there'd also be ships full of sugar and salt and bananas and other types of agricultural products and food and potatoes and clothes and cotton and you name it. So these trade routes, once established, they came to trade everything and every other type of good you could imagine. Now we're going to see the overall number. Remember, that chart we just looked at was just the basically European, African to American slave trade, the triangle trade. Overall worldwide slavery trade, and again, these numbers are soft. These are not hard numbers because, I mean, how good was record keeping in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s? But historians have looked at these over the years and have done their best estimates of what they think the trade is, and that's it. 12 million to the Americas, 6 million to Asia, and 8 million enslaved remaining in the continent. So from the 14 to the 1800s, give or take, a soft number of 26 million African enslaved, 80% male, 20% female. Within Africa, in Asia, into the Americas. 26 million lives destroyed. But it was even more than that, wasn't it? Because all the people who were left behind, families that lost fathers, husbands, kids, societies that couldn't defend themselves from warlords because all the men were dragged away in chains, lives, families destroyed. What about all these people when they went to these other places? They were often used to breed and basically make more slaves. So how many actual slaves came out of that 26 million? I mean, there were people, there were families that might have been brought to the Americas in the 1600s that would have had kids. And those kids had slaves. And those slaves had slaves. I mean, that number of 26 million could be hundreds of millions if you extend that over all the generations, over all the centuries, going back to the 1400s. And this isn't even including the slave trade that existed. We're really just talking about slave trade from the 1800s. We're not even looking at the slave trade that existed in Europe, in Africa and the Middle East, and into India and China and Asia that existed before, the 1400s, before the Europeans basically took it over. It's staggering, really, to think about it. Really. Slaves were a commodity that was bought and sold. However, there were specific requirements that one made one slave more valuable than others. Women slaves were desired for sex and reproduction. Sex trade, reproduction to reproduce. As I said, by the 1800s, many places in America, at least, North America, they found it was more profitable to have natural reproduction rather than to purchase slaves and ship them across the Atlantic. Younger females were preferred for sexual reproductive purposes, going east, going into East Asia. Men, of course, are preferred for labor. 80% of slaves taken to the Americas were male. Going to the east, it was more evenly matched male-female because women were very prized for sexual purposes, sexual slavery. The populations of Eastern and Western Africa, the coastal populations were decimated, destroyed. Of course, the African economy declined, and I think it can be clearly stated. Anyone who looks at this with any type of objectivity or logic can say, Africa has still not recovered from this. Africa as a continent has still not recovered from what was done to them, forced upon them, and stolen from them for century after century after century. We often talk about America, this idea that our American society was built initially for, the first 100 years, 150 years, was really built on the backs of slavery. Really was. 200 years. What we don't see is the bigger picture, that the worldwide dominance and superiority of Western culture, of Europe, of England, America, France, Europe in general, Spain, that worldwide economic, cultural, religious dominance, which still exists today, was built really on slavery, much of it. Let's see what else we want to talk about. The agricultural paradox. African men were pulled out of Africa primarily to work agriculture in the Americas. They were pulled out of Africa to work agriculture in the Americas. The irony there is agriculture was very difficult in Africa because the soil generally is poor soil due to leaching. The soil is actually relatively poor soil because it has been farmed and used and leached due to the tropical rainforest. I'm not going to get into how that works, but it does. The soil is actually terrible. It requires much more labor. It requires several times the labor to produce the same amount of yield, same amount of agricultural yield, versus, say, Europe or the Americas or even Asia. The paradox is these Africans were taken out of Africa to be used for agriculture when they were actually needed in Africa for agriculture at a much greater need. It took 3 African men to produce the same amount of food in Africa as 1 man would produce in the Americas. So they were actually needed much more in Africa for agriculture, and yet they were being pulled out specifically to do agriculture other places. To be farmers for slaves, farmers for Arabs, for whites, and for Asians. Yeah. Number of slaves in millions. This again would be transatlantic. This is America. The slave trade to the Americas, North, Central, South America. 1500s, a few 100,000. 1600s, 2 million. 1700s, you see 7 million. And up through 1866, we threw 3.8 million. I don't know why the book chose the year, why the book authors chose 1866. I'm not sure about that. But we know the slave trade into the Americas existed basically up to the turn of the century, up to close to 1900. 1866 is interesting. Maybe that has to do directly with America because we end slavery in 65, but I can't speak as to why they chose that year exactly. All right, that's it. Thanks for going through this. This is a tough chapter, but it's something that needs to be talked about, and it's important. And, yeah. Thank you. I hope you have a great day.